Hello and welcome to lecture number 18 of this series, and today's lecture will be about 6 materials that are a little bit apart from the others in perfumery because they're originally derived from or suggestive of flavors. They're called in French Gourmand, in English Gourmand. And gourmand in French, even though it's a word of uncertain origin, basically means a glutton, someone who can't stop eating. And these are supposed to be appetizing flavors, and their use in perfumery is in some cases relatively recent, and in other cases, as we shall see, it goes back to the very beginning of perfumery. The first material I want to talk about is vanillin. Vanillin is a very interesting material because vanilla has been used for centuries in Central America, where it comes from, to flavor various things, including chocolate. And it is a very strange material because it arises from fermentation of the bean, which is, I believe, essentially odorless to start with, and gradually darkens and becomes fragrant. And the synthesis of vanillin was, of course, a hugely important event in fragrance chemistry because it made it enormously cheaper. Now, the story of the synthesis of vanillin is rather funny. The two chemists, Tiemann and Harman, who first identified vanillin in the vanilla pods, also figured out a way to synthesize it from wood pulp, to be exact, from a particular molecule in wood pulp, which could serve as a useful starting point. And having made vanillin, Tiemann and Harman published a paper on it, and they decided to set up a fragrance company. And that company became Harman and Reimer, named after the second of the two authors. And of course, they wanted to situate the company in a place where there would be abundant supply of wood pulp. And so they picked a place in the center of Germany called Holzminden. Now, Holz means wood, so you'd figure there'd be a lot of wood around there. And it's almost literally in the middle of nowhere. And it's a small village, and it became essentially the German capital of perfume because it ended up with not only Harman and Reimer, but their arch rival Dragoco in the same village. And eventually the two merged and formed what is today Symrise. Now, there's a famous Symrise perfumer who said to me that this place is so small and so hard to find that when he gets off the airplane at the airport in Frankfurt, and puts it in his GPS, the GPS says, I have no idea where that is. So he claims he's never been able to go to headquarters because the GPS can't find it. The irony of it is that only a couple of years after they'd set up in this place with abundant wood, Tiemann figured out a different vanillin synthesis which did not require wood. So vanillin, the original synthesis of vanillin, created abundant vanillin, and the French licensee for the patent was called Delhaize. Delhaize is a company that has played a gigantic role in French perfumery, and whose history remains to be written. I think the archives of Delhaize are available, but they haven't been studied yet by historians. Guerlain decided to use vanillin in a series of fragrances that defined French perfumery for a long time. So the peculiar thing about vanillin is that it really is a food smell. And in order to turn it into an interesting perfume smell, you have to combine it with things that are inedible. Otherwise, it's trivially the smell of biscuits or the smell of kind of chocolate or the smell of crème anglaise. So what Guerlain did was he took this very, very familiar smell of vanilla, essentially, And he managed to combine it with other materials in such a way that the food idea does not immediately dominate the composition. And one of the funny things that happened was that what made the Tiemann Reimer and de Lair vanillin so interesting was the fact that it was impure. And Jacques Guerlain, the perfumer at Guerlain, really loved the impure vanillin. And when de Lair and Harman and Reimer improved the synthesis and made it more pure, he hated it. And so he asked them to make, for him especially, the old grade, the impure grade, which they did. And they actually charged him more for that, even though it was a lower grade of vanillin, because they made it specially for him, they charged him more. And vanillin to this day is used as a sort of sweet, friendly, warm note in hundreds of fragrances, whether or not it is at the forefront of the fragrance. Now, the second material, which is historically one of the oldest ones and is a gourmand, is Coumarin. Coumarin was synthesized for the first time by William Perkin, who is a really remarkable figure in the history of chemistry, because he was the first person to synthesize a dye called mauve, a purple dye, which made his fortune and revolutionized the textile industry, in fact, fashion. After having done mauve, he synthesized coumarin. Now, coumarin is a very strange smell, and I don't think that there's anything much in ordinary life, at least in Europe, that smells like this. And it's originally found in the Coumarin bean, which is a South American plant. And what's interesting about the Coumarin bean is that, again, like vanilla, it's a product of fermentation. And the coumarin in the bean comes out of the bean and forms crystals. And when you take those crystals from the top of the beans and analyze them, they're essentially 100% pure coumarin, because crystallization forces the impurities out of the crystal because they won't fit in the crystal arrangement. And therefore, coumarin is one of the very few materials where the natural is practically the same degree of purity as a good synthetic. What does it smell of? Well, it's a very complex smell. It has definitely a sort of bitter almondy feel, but also a bitter feel. Bitter almonds is a kind of a sweet smell, even though it comes from bitter almonds. And it was really essential in the invention of a type of fragrance which was the first completely abstract fragrance type, called the fujair, or which is the French word for ferns. Now, ferns do not have a smell, so it's kind of apt that the first completely abstract smell should have the name of an odorless plant. And the first fougère was Fougère Royale in, I believe, 1881, and it used a big slug of coumarin. And in fact, the fougère genre is defined by coumarin, lavender, vanillin in various combinations and proportions. The third material that we're smelling today is one of the most cheerful notes in all of perfumery, and it's called Ethyl maltol, and it is really a flavor. And it is the smell of candy floss. And candy floss smells were first synthesized as flavor molecules, but they were somehow hijacked into perfumery by in the late 70s by one man who I believe really revolutionized perfumery completely. His name was Jean-François Laporte. He was a professor of chemistry in the University of Dijon and a very keen botanist and fragrance chemist. And he started a company called l'Artisan Parfumeur, the artisan perfumer, which was really the first niche fragrance company. And I believe it started in 76 or thereabouts. And his first fragrance, which is still every bit as wonderful and striking as it ever was a composition called Vanillin, which used vanillin, of course, but also used a very large dose of ethyl maltol, which is candy floss. And together, these two somehow got on famously in the fragrance and made the most delicious, summery, happy combination imaginable. And Vanillin really is, to my knowledge, the only fragrance that basically has a suntan. When you smell it in the bottle, it suggests summer and bronzed skin, and it's just utterly wonderful. It should be remembered that the best fragrances in this particular direction are the almost edible, not the edible. In fact, when in the late 80s people wanted to go to the extreme of Gourmand fragrances, they produced a slew of really rather disgusting compositions in which the stuff basically smelled like bad pastry, bad desserts. There's no point in making a fragrance that smells like a bad dessert. In fact, Angel started out as a rather dismal chocolate fragrance. And in the end, in desperation, they mixed this rather flat chocolate base with a floral base and achieved an extraordinary effect, which was a proper fragrance rather than a failed flavor. Now, the fourth molecule I want to talk about today goes by many different names. Most commonly, it's called Sotalone. And it is one of the most potent odorants known to man. It has the smell, it is in fact the smell of everlasting flower, of helichrysum flowers. What does it smell of? It smells halfway between celery and burnt sugar. And it is so powerful that you have to be very careful in the handling of it, because if you happen to, for example, break a bottle of 1 liter of pure Sotalone in a fragrance factory, you will have a lot of trouble getting rid of that smell. You may have to raise the building to the ground and start again. There used to be a kind of prank played by fragrance chemists where you hand someone a sample of pure Sotalone and say, here, smell this. And some people, when they smell it, it's so powerful, they desensitize immediately. So you basically get, with the pure stuff, you get a brief sensation of curry smell, and then nothing much. So you keep breathing, and then when you close the bottle, you find that enough Sotalone has got into your lungs and bloodstream that you basically smell of curry and burnt sugar for a couple of weeks. This is how chemists have fun. Sotalone in perfumery is not an easy note to handle. It's so distinctive, so prominent, that the dosage is extremely hard to get right. If you can smell it, it takes over. And to my knowledge, there's really one fragrance where it is used essentially perfectly. And that is an interesting fragrance because it's basically a gourmand with vanilla, but with a touch of everlasting flower, helichrysum, added to it. And it's called Sable by Annick Goutal, and I reckon it to be one of the great fragrances of all time. Very distinctive vanilla curry, which doesn't sound right when you say it, but smells absolutely right. So the fifth material I'm going to smell today is a material that goes by the absurd name, common name in fragrance of Aldehyde C18, which is really hilarious because it is neither an aldehyde nor does it have 18 carbons. So, in fact, it's a lactone, not an aldehyde. Lactones are esters that are closed on themselves, as we will discuss esters later, but lactone is a particular class of cyclic esters. It has 9 carbons hanging off, and it smells like a sort of soapy coconut. Coconut flavor is, in my opinion, both pleasant and somehow also slightly nauseating. It has a distinctly soapy quality. I mean, when you eat the flesh of the coconut, you get a feeling that you're eating a soap bar sometimes. And this material really embodies the both pleasant and wrong aspects of coconut. Lactones are used extensively in fragrance. There's a one with 11 carbons instead of 9, which is a peach lactone, gamma indica lactone. And they are mysteriously powerful. I don't think anybody really understands why lactones are so potent. They're much more potent than their corresponding esters. And finally, still in the category of flavors that have ended up in fragrance, there's a whole class of compounds that have been extracted from the products of either fermentation, caramelization, which produce very pleasant, warm, foody flavors. And whiskey lactone is one of them. And it's become very popular in the last 10-15 years in masculine fragrances to have what I call affable smells. So the things that are that have the same sort of effect as vanillin, in other words, familiar, warm, reassuring, and sort of edible, but without being vanillic, which has been associated with very much with feminine fragrance. And so this is, if you can imagine, the guy, instead of eating pastry, drinks a good whiskey. This is whiskey lactone. This chemistry of sugars and the formation of maltols and lactones and so on occurs very rapidly in sugar. If you take sugar and dissolve it in water and heat it up, you make caramel. And sugar, saccharose, is a very pure molecule to start with. But as soon as you heat it, it starts a series of chemical reactions which tend to act upon their own products and produce more products. It's a sort of chain reaction of chemistry. And as sugar goes brown and becomes caramel, you start from one molecule, you end up with hundreds. And much of flavor chemistry has to do with the isolation, purification, and synthesis of these molecules that are often quite powerful odorants that arise from the chemistry of a heated sugar solution. Sugars are rather reactive molecules. Most people don't realize that sugars actually exist in a form which is highly reactive, aldehydes, and that's why diabetes is such a nasty disease, because sugars react with proteins to make all sorts of things that impair the function of the body. And so this reactivity of sugars, which is bad if it happens to be in your blood, is good if it happens to be in a chemistry reactor, because it allows you to do an awful lot of chemistry rather cheaply.